Brielle Adams had it all: beauty, brains, and a bright future. But one vanished Snapchat message led her straight into the hands of Tyler Grant, a quiet classmate no one suspected was watching her every move. Brielle Adams was the kind of girl everyone noticed. At 17, she had a presence that made her stand out in the halls of Fairview Hills High School. With long dark hair always styled just right and a carefully curated Instagram feed full of smiling selfies and group photos, Brielle seemed like the definition of a picture-perfect teenager. Teachers praised her for being polite and attentive in class, while students admired her for being confident yet approachable. Her life appeared flawless from the outside. Her parents were successful professionals. Her home was in an upscale neighborhood, and she had a wide circle of friends who constantly tagged her in social media posts about parties, school events, and weekend trips. But behind the well-lit selfies and witty captions, Brielle lived in a world far more complicated than anyone realized. In the last year, she had grown distant from her parents. They chalked it up to typical teenage behavior, the need for independence, the desire for privacy. But there was something deeper happening. At night, long after everyone else had gone to bed, Brielle stayed awake with her phone glowing in the dark. She spent hours on Snapchat, scrolling through stories, joining private group chats, and responding to messages from people she didn't know in real life. The app became her escape, a place where she could shed her perfect image and explore a side of herself she didn't show anyone. The thrill of anonymity drew her in. Unlike other platforms where content was permanent and carefully presented, Snapchat offered freedom. Messages disappeared, images were fleeting, and identities could be hidden behind usernames and bitmojis. At first it was harmless, chatting with classmates, sending funny filters, sharing little secrets. But over time, Brielle was drawn into deeper corners of the app, where strangers offered validation, attention, and sometimes even danger disguised as friendship. Her behavior started to change subtly. She became more secretive, locking her phone the moment someone looked her way. She stopped sharing details about where she was going or who she was with. Her best friend noticed she no longer responded in their group chat as often, and when she did, it was with vague replies and excuses. Teachers saw her zoning out more in class, and her once impeccable grades began to dip. Still, no one saw it as a red flag. She was popular, after all, maybe just going through a phase. Brielle's social media presence remained bright and polished. She continued posting pictures that showed a happy, confident teen living a dream life. But each photo, each video, was carefully constructed to hide the truth. The real Brielle was slipping into an online world where likes and hearts didn't matter, where strangers made her feel seen in ways that real life couldn't. What no one knew was that one of those strangers had grown obsessed. He watched her stories, tracked her locations when possible, and created fake profiles just to stay close. And when Brielle decided to stop responding, to pull away from the person behind the screen, it set off a chain of events that would expose the dark reality behind her perfect life, and lead to a tragedy no one could have imagined. On the evening of January 14th, the Adams household was calm. Brielle told her parents she was heading to a group study session at a friend's house to prepare for midterms. She wore her usual confident smile, grabbed her backpack, and left without raising any suspicion. Her mother reminded her to be home by 10 p.m., and Brielle nodded, promising not to stay out late. It was a routine departure, something that had happened countless times before. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But what happened next would unravel the illusion of safety that surrounded her life. At 7:42 p.m., Brielle posted a photo to Snapchat, a selfie taken in a car, dimly lit by streetlights, with the caption, "Let's make memories." The image lasted just a few seconds before disappearing like every other snap. At first glance it looked like a typical teenage post. Nothing alarming, nothing unusual. But it would be the last sign of life anyone saw from her. By midnight, Brielle still hadn't returned home. Her parents assumed she had fallen asleep at her friend's house, or lost track of time. They tried texting her, but there was no reply. Calls went unanswered. Her phone, which was always glued to her hand, was suddenly unreachable. Her mother's worry grew as the hours passed, but her father tried to remain calm, reminding her that Brielle was responsible and independent. By morning, the panic set in. Her bed was untouched. Her phone was still off. She hadn't shown up for school, and none of her friends had seen or heard from her. That's when her parents called the police. Within hours, a missing persons report was filed, and the search for Brielle Adams began. The town of Fairview Hills was shaken. Flyers went up on telephone poles, and the story made its way onto local news. Volunteers gathered to help search nearby parks, hiking trails, and abandoned buildings. The school organized a support center for students, and her classmates flooded social media with posts begging for her return. But the digital trail she left behind was slim. Snapchat's disappearing nature made it nearly impossible to track her movements or conversation. Investigators focused on the final snap she sent. There were no landmarks, no signs, nothing to indicate where she was. Just her face in a car wearing a black hoodie, hair tucked behind her ears, and a forced smile that now seemed haunting. Police reached out to Snapchat for data, but the platform's privacy policies and ephemeral message structure meant most of the evidence was already gone. As they searched her room, they found her laptop, but her browser history had been wiped clean. Her phone case was found on her desk, but the phone itself was missing. The only hint of her digital activity came from the app itself, a ghost-like map feature showing her last known location somewhere near the edge of town, close to a gas station along a quiet highway. There were no witnesses, no alarms, and no sign of a struggle. Brielle had simply vanished into the night, leaving behind a single, cryptic snap and 1,000 unanswered questions. Investigators knew time was working against them. In the early stages of any missing person case, the first 48 hours are critical, and with every passing minute, the trail behind Brielle grew colder. But the last known clue, the Snapchat selfie, gave them one potential lead. The faint reflection in the car window, barely noticeable at first glance, hinted at something more: a gas station in the background, its bright lights casting a glow just enough to reveal its unique architecture. Detectives cross-referenced the timestamp on the photo with local businesses, and identified 3 gas stations within a 10-mile radius that matched the layout. After hours of reviewing surveillance footage, they narrowed it down to one: a 24-hour gas station located on the outskirts of Fairview Hills. It was a quiet spot, mostly used by truckers and late-night travelers. At 7:39 p.m., just minutes before Brielle's snap, security footage captured a black SUV pulling up to the far end of the parking lot. The quality of the footage was grainy, but it was enough to make out a teenage girl standing outside the passenger door. She looked around nervously before getting into the vehicle. Her outfit matched what Brielle had been wearing in the selfie. Moments later, the SUV drove off, heading toward a direction with no nearby exits or traffic cameras. It was the first concrete evidence confirming she had willingly gotten into someone's vehicle. The problem was, no one could identify the driver. The vehicle's license plate was unreadable due to the camera's poor angle, and the driver remained hidden in the shadows. Investigators turned their attention to Brielle's digital footprint. Although Snapchat messages disappear by default, her phone carrier provided limited metadata, just enough to see that she had exchanged dozens of messages with a user named ShadowAce18 in the days leading up to her disappearance. The username was unfamiliar to her family and friends, and police quickly discovered that it wasn't tied to any real identity. The account was created using a fake email address and a burner phone number, both untraceable. But investigators noticed a pattern. ShadowAce18 had been added to several private Snapchat groups, where teens shared messages anonymously. One of those groups was filled with members using strange usernames, and several had profiles that disappeared shortly after Brielle went missing. Detectives suspected that ShadowAce18 had been communicating with Brielle under the guise of friendship or possibly romance. The content of their messages couldn't be recovered, but the frequency suggested something intense had been developing. Brielle had received messages from the account every day for nearly a month, sometimes up to 50 in a single evening. That level of engagement suggested a growing relationship, or at the very least, manipulation. The fact that all those messages vanished with no trace made the situation more disturbing. Who was behind Shadow Ace 18? And why had they gone to such lengths to hide? The investigation was no longer just about a missing girl. It was now a race to unmask a digital predator. Someone who had used the anonymity of social media to lure Brielle into a trap, and possibly into her final moments. As investigators continued to dig into Brielle's online life, a new name surfaced: Mason Carter. A 21-year-old living in the nearby town of Riverbend, Mason was described by those who knew him as charming but troubled. He had dropped out of community college the previous year and had a minor criminal record, including charges related to underage drinking and trespassing. Mason wasn't a stranger to risky behavior, and more importantly, he wasn't a stranger to Brielle. Her closest friend revealed that Brielle had been seeing Mason in secret for several months. According to her, the relationship began innocently through Snapchat, where Mason had originally messaged Brielle after seeing her tagged in a public story. He introduced himself as a college student who admired her confidence and maturity. Flattered and curious, Brielle responded. What started as casual conversations slowly turned into daily chats, private snaps and late-night calls. Brielle had never mentioned him to her parents. She knew they would never approve of a 21-year-old man dating their underage daughter. Even her friends were kept mostly in the dark, only learning small details here and there. Mason was smart in how he operated. He convinced Brielle to avoid sharing pictures of them together or mentioning his name online. He told her their relationship had to stay private for her protection. At first, Brielle believed him. He made her feel special, like she was older and more sophisticated than her peers. But over time, Mason became more possessive. He questioned who she was texting, grew angry when she didn't respond quickly, and tried to isolate her from her friends. According to messages retrieved from Brielle's phone backup, their relationship had grown tense in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. One friend remembered a disturbing moment when Brielle showed her a message from Mason that read, "You belong to me. No one else will ever understand you like I do." At the time, they laughed it off as overly dramatic, but in hindsight, it painted a much darker picture. When questioned, Mason admitted to the relationship, but insisted he had nothing to do with her disappearance. He said they had broken up 2 weeks earlier and hadn't spoken since. He claimed that Brielle had been drifting away and talking to other guys online. Investigators weren't convinced. His phone records showed several deleted conversations around the time Brielle went missing. He explained them as old chats he no longer wanted, but the timing raised suspicions. Detectives searched Mason's apartment, hoping to find a clue, a piece of clothing, a trace of her DNA, anything that might tie him to the case. But they found nothing substantial. Without physical evidence or witness testimony, they couldn't arrest him. Still, they believed Mason wasn't telling the full story. Perhaps he wasn't directly responsible for her disappearance, but his influence on Brielle had been significant. It was through him that she became more involved in secret online circles, and someone from that digital world had lured her into danger. The search continued, but now with a sharper focus, finding the link between Mason, the anonymous account Shadow Ace 18, and the dark side of the app that had slowly pulled Brielle away from the real world. With Mason no longer the center of attention but still under quiet surveillance, investigators returned to the heart of the case, the Snapchat account that had drawn Brielle into the shadows. Shadow Ace 18. The trail was cold. The account had vanished hours after Brielle was reported missing, along with several others linked to the same private group chats. The case was stalling, public interest was growing, and pressure from the media and Brielle's grieving family pushed the department to try a bold strategy. The police decided to set a trap, a digital sting operation using a fake Snapchat profile. They created the identity of a 16-year-old girl named Kenzie, complete with realistic photos, believable captions, and a backstory similar to Brielle's. The account was carefully crafted to mirror the kind of profile that Shadow Ace 18 typically targeted: confident, socially active, yet emotionally vulnerable. Within days of joining several open and private Snapchat teen groups, Kenzie's inbox began to fill with messages. Most were harmless teenage chatter, but one stood out. A user with the handle NightVoyager21 messaged her directly. His language, tone, and style matched the patterns seen in Shadowace 18's metadata. He used emojis excessively, sent short voice notes, and asked personal questions quickly, pushing boundaries under the disguise of friendliness. The conversation escalated fast. He complimented Kenzie, told her she was mature for her age, and claimed to see through the fake world of social media. It was eerily similar to how Mason had approached Brielle, but detectives believed this was someone else. When Kenzie responded with interest, he suggested they meet just to talk. He said nothing more. He chose the location, an abandoned warehouse outside Fairview Hills, hidden behind trees and long forgotten by most locals. Undercover officers set up a surveillance team around the site. Dressed in plain clothes, they waited quietly in unmarked vehicles, monitoring every movement. Hours passed. Then, just before sunset, a figure appeared at the edge of the lot. A teenage boy walked toward the meeting spot, carrying a phone and wearing a black hoodie. He looked nervous, but calm. When officers approached, he didn't run. Instead, he simply looked up and asked, "Is she inside?" That was all they needed. He was arrested on the spot. The boy was 18-year-old Tyler Grant, a senior at Brielle's high school. Until that moment, his name had never once come up in the investigation. He had no history of violence, no previous run-ins with the law, and no known ties to Mason Carter. Teachers described him as quiet, respectful, and academically strong, the kind of student who faded into the background. But his online life told a different story. Tyler had been running multiple fake Snapchat accounts for over a year. He used them to manipulate, spy on, and psychologically corner teenage girls, including Brielle. Now investigators had finally found the link, not through physical evidence, but through the digital lies that had ensnared a vulnerable girl and led her to a place no one should ever end up. Tyler Grant sat in the interrogation room, silent and composed, as if the weight of the investigation hadn't yet sunk in. But behind that calm exterior was a deeply troubled teenager who had spent the last 2 years constructing a complex digital double life. Once detectives began analyzing his devices, the truth unraveled rapidly. Tyler had been living in 2 completely different worlds, one as the quiet, unnoticed student at school, and another as a manipulative predator lurking behind screens, hidden behind layers of fake profiles. He had created at least 5 Snapchat accounts under different aliases, each with its own personality and tactics. Some were designed to offer emotional support, others posed as flirty, charismatic boys who quickly built trust. These fake accounts interacted not only with Brielle, but also with other local girls, none of whom suspected the truth. Tyler kept detailed notes about each of his targets, what they liked, their interests, who they hung out with, and even the types of emojis they used most. This disturbing level of control and calculation pointed to someone who had been practicing manipulation for far longer than anyone had realized. Brielle was different. Tyler had become fixated on her. He had been in her classes since sophomore year, but had never spoken to her in person. She likely never noticed him, but he noticed everything about her, her smile in the hallway, her group of friends, her style. When he discovered her Snapchat handle through a public post, he saw his chance. Using his most convincing persona, Shadowace 18, he began messaging her anonymously. At first, she was cautious, but over time, he used information from her public posts and stories to gain her trust, pretending they had mutual friends and shared interests. Tyler said all the right things. He mirrored her moods, validated her feelings, and made her believe she had found someone who truly understood her. But when Brielle's relationship with Mason became more serious, she started to drift away from Shadowace. She stopped replying, as often, and even blocked one of the fake accounts. Tyler panicked. In his twisted mind, Brielle was already his, and if she wouldn't come willingly, he'd find a way to bring her back. The night Brielle disappeared, Tyler used a new alias to message her, pretending to be a friend of Mason's who had important information about something Mason had done. The bait worked. Curious and anxious, Brielle agreed to meet him, believing it would bring closure to a complicated relationship. Tyler borrowed his older brother's black SUV without permission and waited at the gas station near the highway. Brielle showed up, confused but hopeful. That was the moment everything changed. Tyler confessed that he had planned to talk to her, to explain everything, to reveal that he was the one behind the messages and that it was all for love. But when Brielle reacted with horror and tried to leave, things spiraled out of control. Tyler's carefully crafted fantasy shattered in an instant, replaced by panic, fear, and irreversible actions that would soon shock the entire town. Tyler's confession was chilling in its detail, and disturbing in its calmness. He didn't cry. He didn't show guilt. Instead, he described the events of that night as if he were narrating a story he had rehearsed 100 times in his head. He said he never meant to hurt Brielle, that everything had been about love, about connection. But the truth revealed something far darker, a plan built on obsession, deception, and control. After luring Brielle to the gas station, Tyler drove her toward a remote area on the outskirts of town. It was a place he had visited before, an abandoned cabin nestled behind thick woods. It belonged to a relative who hadn't used the property in years. Tyler had scoped it out weeks earlier, possibly anticipating that things with Brielle would escalate. In his mind, he believed that if he could just get her alone and explain, she would understand, she would forgive the lies, she would choose him. But when Brielle realized who he was, not a friend of Mason's, not some new confidant, but the faceless voice that had manipulated her for months, she panicked. Tyler said she yelled at him, called him a liar, and demanded to be taken home, but he refused. He begged her to listen, to see his side, to recognize how much he had done for her. The argument grew heated. Brielle tried to run. She pushed him and bolted toward the tree line. That's when Tyler claimed he acted on instinct. He chased after her and grabbed her arm. She struggled. In the scuffle, she tripped and fell backward, hitting her head on a jagged rock. According to his account, everything went silent. He said he knelt beside her, called her name, shook her, but there was no response. Brielle wasn't breathing, she wasn't moving. Instead of calling for help, Tyler went into survival mode. He wrapped her body in a blanket from the cabin and dragged her to a shallow ditch behind the property. He covered her with leaves and dirt, then spent hours wiping down the area, removing any sign that she had been there. He threw her phone into a nearby river, erased the fake accounts from his devices, and deleted all messages. He returned home before sunrise, slipping into bed as if nothing had happened. Tyler's actions didn't end with covering up a death. He had also crafted a narrative for himself online, replying to Brielle's social media posts, as other users, trying to create confusion about her last contacts. He wanted investigators to look elsewhere, at Mason, at strangers, at the shadows of the internet. For a time, it worked, but in the end, it was his own obsession that betrayed him. He couldn't stay away. The fake profile he used to message Kenzie during the sting was too similar in behavior, too desperate to recreate what he had lost. And that single mistake exposed everything. With Tyler in custody and Brielle's body recovered, the case moved into the next phase, justice. But no outcome could undo what had been done. A bright, trusting girl had been taken not by a monster in the dark, but by someone she never even saw coming. The trial of Tyler Grant drew national attention. What began as a local missing persons case had become a chilling example of how digital deception could end in real-life tragedy. The courtroom was packed with reporters, grieving students, and a devastated community that had once considered itself immune to such horrors. Every detail of Tyler's double life was examined and exposed: his fake accounts, his manipulation tactics, his obsession with Brielle, and the months of lies that culminated in her death. The prosecution painted him as a calculated predator, someone who used the disappearing nature of Snapchat to create a network of false identities designed to trap vulnerable girls. They showed the court the extensive planning behind the cabin meeting, the obsessive digital records he kept, and the cold, methodical way he tried to erase Brielle's existence after the fact. His defense argued that her death had been accidental, the result of a moment of panic, not a premeditated act, but the jury wasn't swayed. After 3 weeks of testimony and overwhelming digital evidence, Tyler was found guilty of second-degree murder, kidnapping, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison with no chance of parole for at least. The verdict brought a sense of closure to Brielle's family, but not peace. Nothing could fill the hole left by her absence. Her parents chose to remain mostly silent after the trial, issuing only one statement: Brielle was bright, kind, and full of light. We share her story in hopes that no other family ever has to experience what we have. The town of Fairview Hills changed after Brielle's murder. Schools introduced new digital safety programs. Parents began paying closer attention to their children's online activity. Teenagers who once used Snapchat without a second thought now approached the app with caution. Her story was shared in classrooms, on talk shows, in social media campaigns, not just as a tragedy, but as a warning. Investigators also looked into whether Tyler had harmed others. While no other deaths were linked to him, several girls came forward admitting they had been manipulated by fake profiles eerily similar to Shadoway's. They described how the accounts made them feel important, seen, and special until things turned dark. The psychological damage he left behind extended far beyond Brielle. Snapchat faced its own wave of criticism. The platform's disappearing messages, lack of traceable data, and easy anonymity were called into question. Advocates demanded changes, better safety features, easier access to user data for investigators, and stricter age verification. While some reforms were made, many argued they weren't enough. Brielle's life didn't end with the last snap she sent. Her story lived on, as a reminder that danger doesn't always wear a mask, sometimes it wears a friendly username. Her death wasn't about one bad choice, but about how trust once abused in the digital world can become a weapon. In the end, secrets and lies. The Snapchat murder wasn't just a story of a girl and her killer. It was about how invisible connections can turn deadly, and how the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find a way to surface.